Okay, so I'm going to be basically giving an explication of, as the title suggests, Wilfrid Sellars' Neo-Kantian theory of perceptual experience. So this handsome lad over here is who I'm going to basically be presenting. Now, the sort of format or structure of this sort of explication will be done through five parts, right? So, in the first section, what I call the introductory exposition, is basically going to be me placing his theory of perception within like the history of philosophy, basically, and basically give myself a vindication for why I am doing like an explication of his theory. The second section will go over his demonstrative model, which is very integral to how he understands perceptual experience. The third section is going to be on his abstractionism that avoids the myth of the given. And the fourth section is going to be on his infamous sense impression inference. And the fifth is going to be on the concept of objective purport, to use McDowell's phrase. And this is this quote here from Sellars in his Kant's Transcendental Idealism. Quote, philosophical terminology consists largely of metaphor added to metaphor in the hope that the mixture will crystallize out into clear and distinct categories, end quote. Basically is sort of the theme of this presentation, because of course he is going to be using the metaphors of Kant largely in explicating his account. So without further ado, to section one. So across Sellars' career, he had developed a systematic, though ideally synoptic, vision of philosophy ranging from the theory of meaning, truth, reference, time, experience, and so on and so forth. And at the base of all of it was his theory of perceptual experience, which had pervaded his entire career's focus, right? So we can think of his magnum opus, Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind. It's a it's very much a essay about perceptual experience. And he takes, of course, perceptual experience as the first datum, or as his philosophical inspiration. Immanuel Kant would say, quote, there can be no doubt that all our knowledge begins with experience, end quote. Despite all of this, right, Sellers' account of perception is notoriously obscure, so much so that it led to his career's downfall, as his academic follower Robert Brandom will go on to say, quote, in 1965, 9 years after his triumphant London lectures, these lectures, of course, being Empiricism and the Philosophy of Mind, Sellers was invited back to England to give the prestigious John Locke lectures at Oxford. But his Oxford homecoming was a disaster. The first lecture was well attended, but the material he presented in that lecture was exceptionally difficult. The last three of the six lectures were delivered in the same cavernous auditorium that had accommodated hundreds for the first lecture, but to an audience comprising only a half dozen who had hastily been rounded up. It was a humiliation, and Sellers never got over it. End quote. Yet, even with all of the supposed obscurity, there is much worth to and gain to be had from a faithful explication of his views. For since philosophy is aimed at, quote, becoming reflectively at home in the full complexity of the multidimensional conceptual system in terms of which we suffer, think, and act, end quote, it will only hurt us intellectually to shy away from the flower in the crannied wall, no matter how deep the flower is in the crannies. With the exposition aside, let us set up the metaphor for which Sellers will, of course, use throughout his theory largely. In Science and Metaphysics, Chapter 1, Sellers brings to the fore two types of experiential relations which are immediate, causal and demonstrative. Uh, So, quote, intuitions might be interpreted along causal lines, telling us that intuitions are generated by the immediate impact of things in themselves on our receptivity, end quote. As well as, quote, on the other hand, immediate relation can be construed on the model of the demonstrative this. On this model, which I take to be, on the whole, the correct interpretation, intuitions would be representations of thises and would be conceptual in that peculiar way in which to represent something as a this is conceptual, end quote. Now, what exactly does Sellars mean here by the demonstrative model? Clearly, he has in mind the traditional Aristotelian view of phantasia, or the tot t. Phil Corkum had, in a 2019 paper, had produced a systematic survey of the various interpretations of tot t prevalent in the literature, but Sellars' account seems to compare most analogously with J. A. Smith's 1921 paper account, namely, quote, anything which is both a this and a such and such, end quote, which does justice to the conjunctive condition that Sellars provides for his account of a this such. Now, what exactly is the conjunctive condition? Well, it would be the one right here, right? It would be intuitions would be representations of this is and would be conceptual in that peculiar way in which to represent something as a this is conceptual. And I have it right here, right? Intuitions would be blah, blah, blah. And this conjunctive condition is an important one for Sellars because it allows him to make the distinction between, as he says, quote, what we see and what we see it as. Thus, in the example of a stereogram which hides an image of a dog, and we are told of such, we see of the stereogram some puzzling amalgamation of colors and shapes, but we are trying to see it as a dog. And here we can think of Gilbert Ryle's emphasis on seeing as a task achievement. So for those who are unfamiliar with a stereogram, it's something like this image right here, right? And it hides a 3D image, a 3D figure. Here it's going to be a dog, right? And the point of this image is that if we concentrate on it hard enough, right, we can start to see the dog, right? So here we're trying to see it as a dog. We don't see it as a dog immediately, right? Unless you're just like some stereogram expert, right? But we don't see it immediately as a dog. So we're trying to see it as a dog. So that's the distinction here, right? What we see immediately some amalgamation of colors. And when we see it as, we're trying to see it as a dog, right? So for Sellers, his model is a complex demonstrative one rather than what he calls a pure demonstrative one. So for him, the subject in, quote, this red cube is hard, end quote, is not the referent of this, right? It's not the referent of just the demonstrative here, but this red cube, right? The complex demonstrative, right? That's the subject. And then the predicative component will complete the perceptual experience as a perceptual believing, right? So whatever comes after, right, is hard. The predicative component that will be that will complete it as a perceptual believing, right? Therefore, we can compare his interpretation of intuition in the sense of the demonstrative model to the concept of a perceptual taking. Perceptual takings are, so to speak, thinkings which are evoked in our minds by our environment, or in limiting cases, by abnormal states of our nervous system. We should think of perceptual takings as providing subjects for propositional thought, rather than already having full-fledged propositional form. End quote. Thus, intuitions in the this such model, his complex demonstrative model, provide subjects in the sense of takings for propositional thought. That is, though it is not explicitly propositional in form, it contains the propositional form in the same way that this red cube is big contains the proposition this cube is red, right? Now, abstractionism without the myth of the given. Following Kant, Sellars understands the representations of this suches as essentially containing the this such form because of the act of synthesis by the imagination. Thus, as Kant says, quote, the same function which gives unity to the various representations in a judgment also gives unity to the mere synthesis of various representations in an intuition, end quote, where, quote, the concepts which give unity, end quote, are clearly the categories schematized by the faculty of imagination. In this way, Sellars is able to avoid the myth of the given in the sense that his account does not make, quote, perceptual givens and availability for cognition to subjects whose getting what is supposedly given to them does not draw on capacities required for the sort of cognition in question, end quote, as McDowell would say. Since the perceptual givens in his account, that this such is, do indeed draw on capacities required for the sort of cognition in question, namely the homogeneity of the productive imagination with respect to the categories, or with respect to sensibility and understanding. Um, so, contrary to some popular views, Sellars does not reject givenness per se, but only a species of givens with a capital G, as John McDowell puts it. He has these categorical givens in his system, the quote, existence of completely determinate basic perceptual this suches, end quote, which are explicated in terms of the Aristotelian proper sensibles. From these basic perceptual this suches, we can abstract out in a neo-abstractionist manner further and more conceptually richer this suches till we eventually get to fully fledged propositionally formed believables. Example given from the intuition, this red cube facing me edgewise, to the judgment, this is a red cube facing me edgewise, right? So here, this red cube facing me edgewise does not have an explicit subject predicate form, whereas this is a red cube facing me edgewise does have that subject predicate form. But notice that the subject predicate form is implicit here, right? So since the categorical form contains the implicit subject predicate, i.e., judgmental form. Since intuitions have categorical form, we can find categorical form in them as, quote, since intuitions have categorical form, we can find categorical form in them. In this sense, we can arrive at categorical concepts by abstraction from experience, but only because experience contains intuitions, which have categorical form. We cannot abstract the categories from sensations or images, end quote. Now, what if the immediate causal relation? Sellars here obviously means it in the sense of sensations. But whereas for someone like Descartes, a synsum is a species of thought, Sellars would relegate it as a class of non-apperceptive states of consciousnesses, right? In this way, Sellars avoids what is known as the sense datum inference in favor of his sense impression inference. So, quote, unlike the sense datum inference, the sense impression inference is not a matter of explaining the fact that an object looks red in terms of the idea that there is something, a sense datum, which actually is red. For a sense impression of a red rectangle is neither red nor rectangular, end quote. Sensations lacking categorical form cannot be the intentional objects of our representations. They are, so to speak, representing simpliciter rather than represented representings, right? Here we can think of like Hume and his dual perception theory, right? He clearly thinks of sensations and impressions as represented representings. So the sense impressions are, in Sellars' system, postulated to account for the representational purport or the objective purport of our intuitive representations. Now, postulation in this sense is the same sense that electrons are postulated to account for the observable behavior of a capacitor, right? Sensations then have the role of constraining our intuitive representations from without the conceptual order in the causal order. Now, how does this constraining work, so to speak, right? How does Sellars' perceptual theory have objective purport, that is, directedness towards independent reality. How does this constraining work when sensations lack the conceptual, that is, categorical form of intuitions, right? So whereas intuitions are able to have a sort of guidedness because of the sort of homogeneity it has with the productive imagination, how do sensations how do sensations factor here? They're clearly not homogeneous in the Kantian sense with intuitions. Sellers would give an expository account in terms of a structural isomorphism between sensations and intuitions. So he says, right, quote, the logical space of the qualities and relations which characterize raw feels, of course, being pretty much synonymous with sense impressions, is in certain respects isomorphic with the logical space of the perceptible qualities and relations of physical objects and processes, end quote. Or, quote, impressions have attributes and stand in relations which are counterparts of the attributes and relations of physical objects and events. So, although sensations may lack categorical form, they are related to each other and have attributes which are counterparts to and correspond with the categorical relations and attributes of intuitive representations. Sellers provides, therefore, the cash value, as you would say, for Kant's second postulate of empirical thought in general. Quote, that which is bound up with material conditions of experience, that is, with sensations, is actual, end quote. And here we have pretty much an explication of his theory of perception. And there's more to talk about his theory. I haven't got into like his whole distinction between ostensible seeing and seeing proper, but all of that is pretty much entailed by what I have given so far. So hopefully, with what I have presented, you get a better grasp of his theory of perception.